More than 1,100 U.S. college students have had their visas revoked since January. That's according to Inside Higher Ed. That's an organization that has been tracking the surge in terminations of international student visas. Now, many of the students have reported receiving emails with no explanation as to why their visa has been revoked. That has left many navigating fear, uncertainty, and also misinformation about whether or not they should leave the country on their own. Lawyer and professor at Columbia University Law School, Elora Mukherjee, joins us now to talk about this. Elora, always great to see you.
Thank you, Bud.
We've seen many cases of students receiving emails saying their visas have been revoked. Who is sending those emails, and explain what's being described in those emails that is putting fear into many of these students?
The federal government is sending emails to students, international students across the country at more than 200 colleges and universities, explaining that their status has been revoked in the United States. This puts the students at potential risk of deportation. We are living in an unprecedented time where immigration officers are coming onto college campuses, coming into colleges and universities, arresting students, detaining them, taking them hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from where they're studying. The Secretary of State is also targeting international students and lawful permanent residents based on their speech and purporting to invoke a charge that would make them deportable from the United States. International students across the country are feeling deeply unsettled and afraid of what may happen next. The Trump administration is sending a very clear message that the United States is no longer a welcoming place for many international students from around the world.
So, Professor, explain, though, to our audience what protections international students and non-citizens have when it comes to the Constitution. Now, if you were watching the president's press conference yesterday, he suggested at one point that he might potentially deport American citizens to international prisons. So the Constitution and the laws of the Republic are being threatened, even for those of us who were born here and who are American citizens. But if you're an international student and you're on a student visa, or you are a green card holder, or you're awaiting to take your citizenship test, what kind of protections does the Constitution afford you, specifically as it relates to the First Amendment?
The U.S. Constitution protects all people on U.S. soil, regardless of immigration status. So everyone has a right to remain silent. A person doesn't need to answer questions from immigration officers or law enforcement officers about their name, where they were born, what their immigration status is. They can simply remain silent. Similarly, due process applies to all people on U.S. soil. An international student who has faced the potential of deportation or faced a potential visa revocation has a right to a hearing before being summarily deported from the United States. The First Amendment likewise applies to all people in the United States, regardless of their immigration status, and the federal government shouldn't be targeting people based on protected speech. And finally, in immigration proceedings, people have a right to a lawyer, a right to counsel. This is different from criminal proceedings where there is a right to government-appointed counsel, meaning a lawyer who's paid for by the government. But in immigration proceedings, people have the right to hire their own lawyer at their own expense.
We've seen videos and we've had reports of people essentially being snatched up from the streets by ICE, if that is who was actually doing the abducting. So the question becomes, if you are approached by an ICE, somebody claiming to be from Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, what are your rights in that particular moment? In other words, if you haven't broken any laws, you are here legally on a student visa, or you have a green card, or you have TPS, and all you've done is exercise your First Amendment right to free speech, taking a position that perhaps may be against U.S. policy or U.S. geopolitical strategy. What happens in that moment if you're confronted by a bunch of people claiming to be from Immigration, Customs and Enforcement, and they just load you up into a vehicle?
It's an incredibly difficult and frightening moment for anyone to be in. A person in that situation does have a right to remain silent. They don't need to confirm their identity. They don't need to say what country they're from. They don't need to share what their immigration status is. Once they are detained, if they are detained, then they have the right to make a phone call to a lawyer. Immigrants in this country right now, including international students who've been vocal on the conflict in the Middle East and on other controversial issues, may want to have an emergency plan in place in the event that they are detained. It's also important to know that people can get something called a red card. It is produced by the Immigrant Legal Resources Center. It prints out in writing that a person is invoking their right to remain silent. So instead of speaking with officers, a person can simply hand over that red card if they're approached in public.
And finally, Elora, I guess, you know, there are people who will say, look, even sharing the information that you're sharing is giving aid and comfort to people who they feel have perhaps broken the laws, whether it's this ancient 18th century law that the Secretary of State is using in some cases to deport non-citizens. Just by offering the advice and telling people what their rights are, that is problematic in and of itself. But it is legal to offer the consultation and explain to people what their rights are. And to follow up on that point, should those people, whether they are being just abducted off the street or snatched up by ICE agents or being told to leave, do they have a right to due process? In other words, to stand before a judge and have a judge say whether or not what is happening is legal?
Overwhelmingly, international students in the U.S. who are here on visas have a right to a hearing before an immigration judge before they can be summarily deported from the United States. The due process rights of people in the United States on U.S. soil will depend in part on how long they've been in the United States and what their status is. For example, lawful permanent residents are entitled to a full hearing before they may be deported. For an individual who's been in the United States for less than 2 years and doesn't have a form of immigration relief available to them, they may be subjected to expedited removal, so may not have an opportunity to have a hearing before an immigration judge.
Elora, before we go very quickly, we've talked, this conversation has been focused on people who are here legally, who are either green card holders or have visas that allow them to stay in the United States. But if you are undocumented, there's been a lot of discussion from the White House that you should self-deport. If you're an undocumented person living in this country, it must be incredibly fearful for you. Should people self-deport? And if they do, what are the chances that they ever get back into the United States legally?
In recent days, there have been more than 1 million notices sent out by the Department of Homeland Security asking people to self-deport from the United States within a matter of days. That has sparked so much fear in those who are undocumented as well as those who may have pending immigration cases before the immigration courts. Before a person self-deports, they should contact and consult with a trustworthy immigration lawyer to understand what consequences their departure from the United States may have on their ability to return to the United States. And if a person leaves the United States, it may be complicated for them to return back to the U.S., especially at this moment when our borders are closing and a message has been sent loud and clear throughout the world that America is no longer open to immigrants.
Elora Mukherjee, probably the most important conversation that folks will see on CBS News 24/7 today. Thank you very much for spending some time with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Vlad.